This video is brought to you by Nvidia and Gigabyte Aorus's range of GeForce RTX 40 series super GPUs, delivering cutting-edge features like ray tracing and Nvidia DLSS in games like Black Myth Wukong, Star Wars Outlaws, and more. Stick around to the end of the video to learn more about how Nvidia and Gigabyte can transform the way you play. They don't make games like Space Marine 2 anymore, which is a pretty funny thing to say given that this only came out last week. When developer Saber Interactive announced that they were picking up where Relic Entertainment left off, there was every reason to be skeptical. Firstly, it's a whole different studio, and when franchises make the jump to a new home, a lot typically gets lost in translation. See stuff like Homeworld 3 or Risk of Rain 2 for some examples of that. Secondly, this is a Warhammer game we're talking about, and let's be real, 9 out of 10 Warhammer games suck. That ratio has improved substantially over the last few years, so let's maybe call it 8 out of 10, but history has left us with a very clear and very trackable pattern that gives us a cautious and uneasy feeling every time a new Warhammer game is announced. Thirdly, Space Marine is an important milestone in the Warhammer 40k gaming pantheon. It was that 1 out of 10 good Warhammer game against which many others were measured, and it's naturally going to be pretty tough to live up to a legacy like that. Fourthly and finally, the way games are built and monetized in the modern era could not be more starkly different than when Relic released Space Marine into the market back in 2011. Back then, you could just make a co-op shooter. It didn't need to be a live service. Back then, you could just charge the price of a game. It didn't need to have an in-game cash shop selling unique skins for $40 a pop. Back then, you could have a goofy PvP mode that was just dumb fun. It didn't need to have lots of complex progression systems, a battle pass with a premium tier, and a separate cash shop selling timed XP boosters. So a Space Marine 2 released in 2024 couldn't possibly be like what people got back in the day because times have changed and we just have to accept that. You know who didn't accept that? Saber Interactive, because Space Marine 2 bucks so many modern trends that it feels almost outdated in the best possible way. This is a game that delivers a compelling, dense 6 to 8 hour campaign experience full of some of the best art direction and spectacle you've ever seen, all of it running absolutely flawlessly. It has a memorable core cast of characters and a plot that's pretty messy, but the personal drama really gets its hooks into you. When the credits roll on that, there are 6 more co-op PvE missions awaiting you, each of them 30 to 45 minutes long, each of them randomized in terms of enemy spawns and boss placement. That game mode gets its longevity from the brilliant class design and progression that adds a strategic dimension to moment-to-moment gameplay, but also incentivizes you to keep coming back to unlock better equipment and more visual customization options, which are so numerous that they feel almost overwhelming. To cap all of this off, there's this 5v5 PvP game mode that's just dumb fun. It's janky and unbalanced, but man, it's really fun. And how this game mode made it into the final release rather than ending up on the cutting room floor is a total mystery to me, given that games don't launch like this in 2024. Like, which recent release can you point to that has a campaign, a totally separate co-op PvE mode, and a totally separate PvP mode? Who is doing that in 2024? And most remarkable of all, there is no in-game cash shop, no battle pass, no $40 skins. There is a season pass that'll give you some additional chapter colors and variants, but you get more than enough in the base game, and the season pass is ultimately funding future content which will all be free. And the future content includes more PvE co-op missions, more weapons, more enemy types, more PvP game modes, and loads of other stuff. Like, how does this product exist in 2024? At the same time, I don't want to get caught up in the very surprising commercials of this game, because separate from all of this, this is just a great fucking video game. The campaign is a little weak, I think, but the co-op PvE stuff, man, I'm like 30 hours deep in that right now, and I have no plans to stop anytime soon. It is so good, and the PvP, I totally wrote it off when I started playing it. I was like, well, that looks kind of dumb, and make no mistake, it is, but it's dumb fun, and it's so much more fun than it has any right to be. There are a few things to nitpick at when it comes to Space Marine 2, for sure, but I honestly believe that this is like one of the most consequential releases of 2024 because it shows that you can still release a game today that feels like it was plucked from the 360 era. The fundamentals that made games of that era great still hold true today, and while I don't imagine it's going to lead to a wave of copycats and imitators from other developers and publishers, I'm just really grateful that Saber Interactive managed to pull this one together, because by God, it must have been hard for them to have made something this good, for them to have included so much in it, and for them to have charged such a reasonable price for it.
The situation here has deteriorated. Those foul gargoyles pollute the skies.
Our brothers are getting hammered down there.
It's been a long time since I've done a dedicated block in a review devoted entirely to visuals, but Space Marine 2 compels me. When it comes to graphical leaps from one generation to the next, this generation has been the most uneven and least satisfying generation in the history of gaming. Part of that is because we're well into the territory of diminishing returns, where the jump from PS4 to 5 cannot reasonably be anything close to the jump from 2D to 3D, or the jump from PS1 to PS2, etc. But part of it is to do with the fact that this generation also seems to be keeping one foot firmly in the last generation, many games shipping on PS4 and Xbox One because that's where the bulk of the player base still is. When games do make the sort of graphical leaps we're hoping for, the results can often be patchy. Forspoken was one of the first games to leave behind the last generation, and we all remember how that went. Same for Immortals of Avium. Yeah, we get Black Myth Wukong and Hellblade 2, which look like the generational leaps we were hoping for, but they feel like the exceptions in what has been a pretty underwhelming generation that has failed to deliver consistently impressive visuals that make you really happy that you shelled out big dollars for a current-gen console or a pricey GPU. If you are feeling that way, and if you want a game that makes you just sit back and go, fuck yeah, man, then buy Space Marine 2. If you want a game you can show off to your friends when they come over and be like, bro, look at this, buy Space Marine 2. If you want a game that re-baselines your expectations for what we define as cutting-edge visual presentation in the current console and GPU generation, buy Space Marine 2. I am not a graphics whore. Most of the time, I couldn't care less, but sometimes a game comes out swinging so hard that you better duck or be prepared to get laid out. Space Marine 2 is that kind of game that is so unbelievably good looking that it takes the experience to a whole new level, like Cyberpunk's visuals do. To this day, I still keep that game installed just so I can cruise around Night City and look at it. Space Marine 2 is the same, and after spending some 40 hours with it, some of my most vivid memories of it were the first time I saw some vista, or some battlefield, or some towering monument before me, all of it immersing me in this brutal world as no other game before it has managed to do. Because this is Warhammer 40k, and as someone who is a casual enjoyer of the 40k universe, this is incredible, but I can't imagine what it would be like for real 40k fans to see their universe brought to life like this. Like, I honestly just can't. The visual magnificence of Space Marine 2 is a combination of the decades worth of work that has gone into the Warhammer 40k art design, combined with Saber Interactive's own unique take on those designs, combined with so many layers of technical wizardry. You got these skyboxes that are basically the best I've seen in a video game, combined with this horde tech that lets you have hundreds of unique units on screen at a time, combined with these incredibly detailed assets that can withstand the closest of up-close scrutiny, combined with engine optimizations that lets my high-end PC run this thing at 4K, max settings, 120 FPS, supported by NVIDIA DLSS. And that's just regular DLSS, by the way. It's not DLSS 3 with the AI frames being interlaced. Technically and artistically, Space Marine 2 is just as much a powerhouse as the Ultramarines are themselves. If this doesn't win Best Art Direction at the Game Awards, I'm going to be so mad. I never recommend buying a game based on its visuals, but there are some games that you just need to see, and watching it on YouTube doesn't count, I promise you. Not until you yourself are tilting that camera up to see the top of that cathedral ship, or panning the camera across to take in the full span of a cascading Tyranid horde, will you be able to appreciate just how hard Saber Interactive have cooked here. It's a high point for this generation, and I guarantee you, this game is going to age beautifully, because it is difficult to imagine how you could make Warhammer 40k look any better than this.
My salvation is my reward. My craft is death. My pledge is eternal service.
Space Marine 2 continues the story of Dimitri and Titus. Never a more pure faith in the God Emperor than his, Titus is wrongly accused of heresy at the conclusion of the first game and banished to a term of penance in the Death Watch, an elite Astartes chapter that is the Fist of the Inquisition. We rejoin Titus in what would be, unbeknownst to him, the conclusion of that penance. A mission against the Tyranids sees his entire squad wiped out, himself included. And when Titus awakens, it's as a Primaris, a new breed of Space Marine that is even stronger than the Firstborn. Still, Titus's mysterious past makes the brass uneasy, and to quell tensions, Titus is demoted to the rank of Lieutenant. Now Titus begins his eternal service anew, pushing back the endless scourge of the Tyranids and Chaos forces while trying to win the trust of his battle brothers, proving once and for all that his faith in the Emperor is beyond reproach. Warhammer lore is, rather famously, as dense and unending as a Tyranid swarm itself, and trying to engage with any part of it is a deeply dangerous affair, as you may or may not find yourself tumbling down a rabbit hole that sees you listening to 12-hour-long lore videos or spending thousands of dollars on little metal toys. Warhammer games do not have the luxury of diving deep into the lore because there's simply too much of it to cover, and so the best ones do a clever job of focusing their world building and narratives around one or two pillars and then dropping plenty of Easter eggs and nods and breadcrumbs that denote to the faithful that the people at the helm have actually done their homework. Saber Interactive really understood the assignment here. This is a story centered on Space Marines, and that's where the bulk of the world building takes place. You will meet iconic characters from across the Space Marine pantheon, but more importantly, you'll hear about how they're bred, about the campaigns they've served in. You'll see their religious observances and experience firsthand their tense relationship with the Adeptus Mechanicus. Warhammer fans often say that Ultramarines are the single most boring part of the 40k universe, and having read a few books and played a bunch of games, I can get where they're coming from, but for a normie like me, Ultramarines are fucking cool, man, and seeing them kneel in prayer or performing the rite of armor communion in the middle of a mission, it's just cool, man. I'm super into it. Outside of that, there's a whole storyline about fighting the Tyranids. They can never be too interesting given the Tyranids are just like bugs that can't speak. They're essentially a little more than a really disruptive weather event, and while that makes for cool spectacle and tense butt-clenching missions, they do not a great villain make. That's where the forces of chaos are meant to do the heavy lifting, and at around about the halfway point in the campaign, they suddenly appear trying to seize control of some MacGuffin to do something. They're led by a guy who is clearly evil, but I don't know what else his deal is. There's a trip to the warp at the end, which I think is kind of a no-no according to anyone who cares about 40k lore. Listen, here's the thing. I am nowhere near knowledgeable enough to be able to comment on how lore accurate all of this stuff is, but I will tell you that from a straight-up storytelling perspective, you're not going to care all that much about what is happening with this evil dude whose name I honestly forgot 3 seconds after hearing it. It's just a lot of MacGuffins and bluster and really badly mixed audio that makes it borderline impossible to hear what the bad guy is saying half the time. It's just not an interesting part of the experience, at least for me. But I actually don't care about that because I was much more invested in the personal drama that was happening within Titus's squad. He's leading 2 battle brothers, one who has his doubts about Titus but he's keeping an open mind, and the other one who just straight up does not like Titus, doesn't trust him, and gives him stink eye whenever the camera pans his way.
Our lieutenant said it himself. There's deception at work.
If you got something to say, Sergeant.
The story that unfolds between these 3 dudes is very Jarhead-esque. It is about following orders versus trusting your gut. One of the dudes goes on an inexplicable murderous rampage and needs to be brought to heel by his squad mates. There's tense moments where Titus is evasive as his battle brothers pry into his mysterious past. There's the threat of mutiny in the air as none of them are willing to do the bravest and most manly thing of all, just hug it out. All of this is rather deftly handled with curt dialogue that typically begins and ends with the word brother, but the strong voice performances infuse all of it with emotion and gravitas. It's not a particularly deep military brotherhood story, but it's an effective one, and I found it more than made up for the shortcomings of the broader plot.
The Cadians are holding the bridge at great cost. Set up assault positions by the bridge. We'll deal with the Neurothrow. Very well. We will avenge them, brother. Watch yourself.
The campaign is 6 missions long. You may look at that number and think, that's not much. But that number is a little deceiving because each mission is around 45 minutes long and the last mission is like an hour and a half. All in, we're looking at around 6 to 8 hours for the campaign, but that number is also deceiving because the campaign also plays out in the co-op PvE mode, since the missions there are offshoots from the storylines unfolding in the campaign. There's 6 missions over there and they too are typically around 30 to 45 minutes long, and they're way more replayable given how much they change up enemy and boss spawn locations. So I think it's better to think of this as a really dense 15-hour campaign experience, with roughly half of that having a lot of replayability depending on how much all of the progression and cosmetic stuff appeals to you. I will tell you though that I think the campaign experience is the weakest part of the overall Space Marine 2 package. It is where you will see the best visuals, but it's also where the core gameplay has the least variation and where all of the game's progression and customization systems are turned off. At a basic level, missions are pretty straightforward affairs. You are Titus and Titus only. Your job is to murder everything you see. You will do this in almost the exact same way from the first moment of the campaign to the last. Titus does not have a skill or progression tree that gives him new capabilities throughout the campaign. There are a number of signature abilities present in the co-op PvE side of the game that Titus never gets to make use of. Stuff like a tactical scanner or a grapple hook or the Heavy's defense dome. These are really cool things that define your class's capabilities abilities in the co-op side of the game, but you wouldn't know they even existed if you only played the campaign. The only other signature ability you get your hands on is this jetpack thing, and honestly, these sequences are like the highlight of the campaign because it feels good to be doing something different from the regular shooting and stabbing. There's a really big problem with weapon identity in this campaign. There are quite a few weapons in Space Marine 2, from bolters to lasguns to heavy bolters and sniper rifles, but because of the way that enemies and scenarios are designed, there's never much benefit in using one weapon or the other. They all get the job done perfectly fine, so you will experiment quite a bit in the beginning to see what does what, but in the end you're just going to settle for the auto bolt rifle because it works 100% of the time. It's a problem resolved in the co-op PvE mode because certain classes can only use certain weapon types, and the subtle differences between those weapons become important when paired with the overall strengths and weaknesses of classes. But that subtlety is lost during the campaign, and as such the weapons feel much more generic and interchangeable than they actually are. So to be clear, all of these issues of progression and signature abilities and weapon identity are resolved in the co-op PvE side of the game because the class system gives you a progression tree and more abilities and also makes weapons mean more. But the co-op PvE mode cannot solve the biggest problem this game faces, and that's its very awkward implementation of push-forward combat. Push-forward combat is a term we got from id Software when they were designing Doom 2016. It's the idea that regen, both health and ammo, should come from aggression rather than retreat. That's why you get glory kills that give you the sustain you need to keep pushing forward. Space Marine 2 does the exact same thing. You have health which only goes down when your armor is depleted. With some limited exceptions, the only way to restore your health is with a Medicaid stim pack. Your armor, on the other hand, is restored every time you perform an execution on a major or minor enemy, which means that you are constantly, and I mean constantly, executing stuff to restore all of the armor that gets chipped away by the enemies constantly surrounding you. Thematically, a Space Marine ripping Tyranids in half with his bare hands or decapitating a Chaos Marine as you would open a can of beer is perfectly fitting. Frankly, it's difficult to imagine how you could do it any other way. The problem is that it's just not dialed in correctly. The execution animations often take a little bit too long, your armor pool is so low that you need to perform these executions too often, you'll often find yourself shooting enemies in small bursts or doing single melee swings hoping to trigger their executable state, because accidentally killing an enemy without executing them means that you've lost a health source. You're also competing for these executions with your battle brothers when playing co-op, which can be super annoying if someone keeps snaking them when you're desperate for some armor. There's also no alternatives to this method of regenning armor, which actually makes range play much more frustrating than it otherwise should be, since you always need to end up in melee range to restore your armor. This reliance on executions suffocates the core gameplay flow, and ultimately holds Space Marine 2's combat back from achieving its full potential. Doom is the template on which Space Marine 2's push-forward combat is based, but you never felt too leveraged into the glory kills there, like that's all you were doing. The broader combat experience had more room to breathe, and you had alternative sources of health and ammo. Space Marine 2 just doesn't quite get it right. Having said all of this is not a terminal problem. It doesn't kill the gameplay loop entirely. I've spent over 40 hours with this game and I plan to continue playing it. I honestly love it because that core loop of shoot, cleave, dodge and execute is enough to keep me coming back. But it could have been more than it is, and if you're only playing the campaign experience, I think you're going to come away thinking that Space Marine 2's combat lacks depth and doesn't have the sort of legs that can sustain it over dozens of hours. The truth is, it actually does, but to experience that, you really need to be putting some hours into the PvE co-op mode, because that's where the game really shines.
Collapse the superstructure from below.
As I mentioned earlier, the entire campaign can be played co-op, but there's little reason to replay that, given that it doesn't have any progression or cosmetic customization, etc. In addition to those 6 missions are another 6 co-op PvE missions that are separate from but related to the campaign. It's really clever the way the game handles it. Titus will be like, we need someone to kill the hive mind, but we're busy doing other things. So Titus will order a separate squad of Space Marines to go and kill the hive boss while he focuses on his mission. In the campaign, all you hear over comms is, the hive mind is dead, and that's initially really unsatisfying because you're like, why didn't I get to kill the hive mind? That sounds like fun. It's only when you reach the co-op PvE mode that you actually get to play the mission where the hive mind dies. That's what makes these co-op PvE missions feel so integral and connected to the overall package. You really haven't experienced the full campaign playthrough until you've played through these missions as well, and it imbues each of them with so much more importance because you're working towards objectives that Titus himself is reliant on in the campaign story beats. These missions are just as long and meaty as the campaign missions, but they're actually far more interesting in their objectives and scenarios. The campaign really fails to deliver when it comes to boss encounters or scenarios that are more sophisticated than just shoot everything that moves. I suppose that's because that experience can be played solo with bots, and since the bots in this game are dumber than a lobotomized servo skull, Saber couldn't really design campaign moments where you had to rely on bots to do a thing. Co-op PvE missions, on the other hand, are predicated on 3 human players. There is cross-platform matchmaking enabled by default, and if you can't find someone to play with, the game will match you with a bot until someone eventually arrives, since you can join in-progress missions. With 3 actual people in the mix, the mission design is significantly more sophisticated, interesting, and challenging. One mission involves a boss encounter that's so much more challenging than anything else in the campaign. Another mission has a different boss encounter that involves activating special symbols to make the boss vulnerable. Another involves escorting a giant battery between different locations, and you need someone on the battery to move it, and another person to align the tracks this way or that. There's an entire section in one mission where you're being buzzed by this giant Helldrake thing, and you need to run between different cover points to avoid its fire. The list goes on, to be honest. There's probably another half a dozen examples of these co-op-centric mechanics that are challenging to pull off when you're under the pressure of Tyranid or Chaos forces. It's a sort of scenario design that's just sorely lacking in the campaign, but yeah, it's here and it's great. In addition to that, there's a lot of variation built into each mission, such that different sections of each level play out entirely differently depending on what enemies or bosses are spawning in. One run of a specific section might be really chill with just a few enemies spawning. The next time, it might be a major flashpoint with seemingly endless waves of enemies capped off by a mini-boss encounter. Levels are always the same in terms of their layouts, but there's an unpredictability built into their scenario design that keeps them feeling fresh. Then of course you get to the 4 difficulty tiers, which change things up even further. Obviously you can expect more enemies that have more health and deal more damage as you move up the tiers, and I would say this game really only hits its stride in that 3rd tier. It's at that point where you really need to lock in to get it done, and it's where the intricacies of the class and weapon design start to make themselves felt, because you really start reaching for every single advantage you can get your hands on in order to survive. And this is where we get to the class stuff. There are 6 classes in the co-op PvE mode. They're all murderous Space Marines, sure, but they all have a unique conceit that allows them to bring something specific to the battlefield. There's a class that focuses on sniping, one that focuses on heavy weapons, another that focuses on aerial combat. My guy was the Bulwark, because I love me a shield bro, and he's all about shield bashes to clear hordes and stagger big targets. He can block most frontal damage, and he's what you want on the front line, while a heavy or a sniper picks off targets at range. His signature ability is a standard that restores armor over time. It can also damage enemies depending on how you spec into it. More on that later. Thing is, playing with this guy versus playing a heavy, you're playing 2 completely different games at that point. The heavy is exposed when stuff gets up close, but his DPS throughput at range is unmatched. The Bulwark excels up close, but his range damage is basically non-existent. In the co-op PvE mode, classes have big strengths and big weaknesses, and you need to not only play around those things, but also you need to play around the strengths and weaknesses of your teammates, because they're reliant on you to bring what they can't. When you get to that 3rd difficulty tier, all of this starts really humming, and you can feel when you're in a squad of people who know what they're doing versus a squad of people who are just pressing buttons. It's a total wash when that happens, by the way. Like, you're not going to finish the mission. But if you've got people who know how to play their class and they know how to work together, you can push through some crazy shit. And to Saber's credit, they really perfectly dialed in things like health economies and enemy counts here. So often it feels like you're on your absolute last bullet and your last gasp, but somehow you make it through, and it's not easy for a game to so consistently deliver that feeling. A big part of your ability to push into these higher difficulties is the progression and customization that's present here only in the co-op PvE mode. You don't get any of this in the campaign or the PvP mode, it's all in the co-op, and it's kind of a shame, because it is so good that the rest of the game would have been greatly enhanced had it been present in those other modes as well. Whether it's across perk trees, weapon customization, or visual adornment, Space Marine 2's progression systems are a veritable tour de force, and I don't use that term lightly. This really is very good stuff. Each class in the roster levels up independently. There is no shared XP pool that levels up all classes at once. You might be able to play your Bulwark in high level content because you put the time into him, but if your Assault is level 1, then you're going back to the base difficulty level to level him up. This may strike some as a bit frustrating, going back to the easier game modes when you're used to something more challenging, but this is kind of smart because it helps maintain the player populations on those easier difficulties, and it's also kind of nice to go back and play a more relaxed version of the game after hours of grinding the sweaty hard modes. XP rewards are pretty stingy. It does take quite a few hours to level up a character, and again, I can see how this might piss people off, especially given that there's only 6 PvE missions right now, and depending on how much you enjoy those, that feeling of repetitiveness can set in quickly. Personally, I'm finding the slow release of XP to be rather satisfying in the age of instant gratification. See, there's no battle pass here, there's no timed rewards, there's no seasonal content that disappears after 3 months, no seasonal reset, no future gear score increases, no FOMO. The leveling journey we have with these classes is the only leveling experience we're ever going to get with them, so I don't mind that it takes a while because we can do it at our own pace and not feel guilty about it. It gives the game plenty of long-tail replayability without the game feeling like a second job, a trap that many of these sorts of games fall into these days. What makes this even better is how genuinely rewarding this leveling experience is, because Saber Interactive have sidestepped basically all of the pitfalls associated with progression. Leveling up your class does not give them more innate stats, because that's kind of pointless, given that higher difficulties erase the relative values of those stats. Think Diablo 4, for example, where you kept getting stronger, but so did the world around you, so you didn't feel stronger at all. Here in Space Marine 2, leveling up your class gives you access to perk points that provide very potent situational buffs that incentivize certain playstyles. My Bulwark, for example, he has a bunch of perks that give me bonus health, armor, and damage whenever I perform perfect parries or dodges. Alternatively, there are a bunch of perks that provide me a lot of recovery when I fuck up, like dropping a stun grenade when my armor is depleted, or reducing my health damage taken when my armor is depleted. There's also team-wide buffs I bring, like armor recovering more quickly outside of combat, or my battle standard recovering health in addition to armor. The point is, every perk here is an important choice that allows you to define a playstyle and to become way more powerful without just stuffing you full of cheap stats. It's a pitch-perfect approach to class design and progression, and I really wish more games did it exactly like this. Similar story for weapons. There are tiers that have higher base stats, sure, but more importantly, weapons get different characteristics that manifestly change how they perform. Faster reload versus bigger magazine, higher per bullet damage versus lower rate of fire. The swords are particularly interesting because there are swords that specialize in big wide cleaves while others focus on smaller arcs. There are swords that deal way more damage but they remove your ability to parry, and other swords that give you a more forgiving parry window but less damage. Again, the raw stat increases aren't the focus of progression. It's about choosing upgrades that mean something, that affect your playstyle, that give you unique strengths and weaknesses. Again, just pitch perfect. And then we get to the visual customization, which is like, I mean, it's honestly kind of unbelievable, especially in this modern era. Each class has a whole visual progression thing going on, which makes them look more and more fucking cool as you level them up. But if you don't like a specific part of the upgrade, like the pauldrons or the chestplate, you can swap it out for one of the other options. There are dozens and dozens of chapter colors and emblems here, and you can customize the patterns and colors for each individual piece of armor that you have. Some of this stuff is behind a DLC paywall, sure, and we'll talk more about that later, but most of it is just earnable by playing the game, and you don't feel as though Saber held back the best armor designs and best colors to get you to spend money. It's kind of like what we should expect from a video game, but in the modern era, our expectations are so low that this feels exceedingly generous. Whether it's XP curves, skill trees, weapon upgrades, or visual customization, Space Marine 2 just goes so unbelievably hard. It is such a surprise, but oddly enough, it is not the most surprising aspect of this package. Warhammer 40k Space Marine has a 5v5 PvP mode that has 3 maps and 3 distinct game modes. All of it is predicated on the same class design as the co-op PvE mode, except without any of the perk point progression stuff on weapons or skill trees. It's 10 burly dudes running around labyrinthine maps, shooting each other until the buzzer sounds. There are no meaningful rewards for doing well. You don't unlock special armor or cosmetics that you can use in the campaign or co-op PvE missions. It's just a basic ass PvP mode that you can play for fun. When I first encountered this and saw how limited all of this was, my broken, live service-addled brain was like, what? That's it? I thought it felt almost silly for Saber to have poured so many resources into this given how little it was shooting for. I mean, no one's buying Space Marine 2 to play the PvP, right? So wouldn't it have been smarter for the developers to just make more campaign or co-op PvE content? Well, that was a really dumb thought on my part for 2 reasons. Number 1, it sells short just how much fun this PvP actually is. It's so simple, it's got some major class and balance issues, and melee encounters feel more like a coin flip than an actual duel. But damn if this isn't just some good old-fashioned Xbox 360 era fun. The class design means you're always bringing something unique to the battlefield, and you need to work as a team because you're reliant on the weapons and abilities that other teammates are bringing. The health pools and weapon damage output tuning feels really on point, such that no classes feel like a glass cannon, nor do targets feel really bullet spongy. The map design is actually sick. Not only do they look great, but they also provide a good mix of narrow corridors, choke points, and open plan spaces. That mix creates plenty of different sorts of engagements and lets different classes make use of their kit, like a bulwark locking down an entry into an objective, or the assault class dive bombing in behind enemy lines. Rounds are often close, the tension in the final moments is there. I'm invested in the outcome even though I'm not going to get any reward from it. And that is the mark of a great PvP experience. When you care just because it's fun, not because of XP bonuses or some unique weapon skin being dangled in front of you like a carrot, just because it is fun. And that kind of leads into the second reason why my dismissing all of this was really dumb. I think the fact this PvP mode exists is like the boldest statement that Saber Interactive makes in this entire package. During development, there must have been so much pressure to scrap this game mode because, like I said, no one is buying Space Marine 2 to play the PvP. They would have got 0 incremental sales for including this. No one would have been like, well, I wasn't going to buy Space Marine 2 for the campaign and co-op PvE stuff, but now that I hear it's got a basic-ass PvP mode, I'm going to cop. No one would have said that. I'm certain that Saber would have had to have fought hard to keep this game mode in scope, to keep it in the budget, and the fact that they managed to pull it off makes Space Marine 2 feel like a relic of a bygone era, something discovered and exhumed from a time when games were built this way, when development budgets weren't so massive so publishers were willing to take some risks, when the inclusion of a bare-bones PvP mode was seen as something to stop people from trading in their games, when the multiplayer modes were subsidized by the box sales rather than by the cash shop attached to the multiplayer mode that's selling skins for half the price of a AAA game. There's no cash shop attached to the PvP mode in Space Marine 2, and I ask you, who the fuck is launching a PvP experience in 2024 without a cash shop? It's something that makes me really optimistic about the future of this game because, make no mistake, we got a huge amount on day 1, but there's more coming, and believe it or not, all of it is free. One thing that's particularly fascinating about Space Marine 2 is its approach to monetization and future content. To be clear, Saber Interactive have very wisely not marketed Space Marine 2 as a live service because it isn't. It's a complete box product that's meant to stand on its own 2 feet as something that can be enjoyed now, free from the ephemeral promise of future content, which will eventually justify the upfront purchase price. No, Space Marine 2 offers more than enough on day 1 to justify a purchase, but there's also more coming later on, and all of the actual playable content is free, subsidized by a season pass that grants only cosmetic items. This month we'll see the addition of a sparring arena in the Battle Barge. Season 2, which drops later this year, will deliver new PvE co-op missions, a new lethal difficulty for those wanting an extra challenge, and a new weapon type. Seasons 3 and 4 will drop in 2025, and they'll drop even more PvE missions, more PvP game modes, and a PvP prestige system, new enemy types, another new weapon, and a dedicated horde mode. And that is all 100% free when you buy the base game. That is pretty cool. Also important to note that there is no in-game cash shop here, and right now the only form of monetization attached to the game is a season pass, which comes with a bunch of cosmetics now, and the promise of lots more in the future. When I first saw all this stuff, I was like, man, I bet you they're really gonna nickel and dime you on the free cosmetics to get you buying this shit. You can absolutely imagine a situation like Warhammer 40k Darktide, where there was absolutely nothing available to earn for free, and all of the good stuff was put behind a paywall. But Emperor be praised, the madmen and women at Saber Interactive didn't do that. I showed you earlier, there is so much cosmetic customization available here for free, so much to earn, so much to tinker with. It is such a rich offering that delivers that initial feeling of satisfaction that feels so rare from modern live service launches, and generates the kind of goodwill that makes you feel optimistic about how this developer and publisher will treat you in the future. And like, that's the thing that really strikes me about all of this. Warhammer fans are used to spending hundreds or even thousands of dollars on their hobby. It would have been very tempting to try to fleece this audience. And the fact that Saber and Focus didn't do that, the fact that they rocked up with a really complete and compelling day one package, the fact that they're making all future content for free, the fact that they seem focused on the long game without sacrificing the here and now, that is so refreshing. And it's like, why can't it always be like this? Why do we have to drudge through so much half-baked, overpriced, over-monetized slop before we finally get to a game and a developer that's like, don't worry man, we got you. I don't know, maybe Saber and Focus break my heart in the coming months and years, sure, maybe. But right now, I am just so impressed at what they have put out here. Yeah, it's got some issues. Some of the combat stuff is a little too rigid, too repetitive, too sing-songy. The campaign has plenty of spectacle, but its underutilization of weapons, classes, and signature abilities can make the game feel more one-dimensional than it actually is. The online infrastructure is unreliable and painful to have to deal with, and the online progression can feel a little slow given that there's only 6 missions at the moment. But outside of that, man, it's hard to imagine how Saber could have crushed this any harder. I love this video game, I really do. I liked it when I played through the campaign for its visuals, its presentation, and its compelling character drama that really pulled me in, but the more I spent time playing the co-op PvE stuff, the more I fell in love with what is an incredibly well-made co-op shooter experience that I think has a very long life ahead of it. I can absolutely see the player counts holding up here. I can see major content expansions in the years ahead. I can see this becoming one of those live service experiences that we celebrate rather than groan about. The foundation here is just so strong, and whether you pick it up now or in 2 years' time, you're going to have a really good time with this. I strongly recommend it to you. Always extremely proud to be able to partner with this video's sponsors, Nvidia and Gigabyte Aorus. Gigabyte Aorus's GeForce RTX 4080 Super delivers all of the incredible performance and technology you've come to expect from Nvidia, with the added features, reliability, and support that Gigabyte Aorus are famous for. 40 series GPUs deliver the absolute cutting edge in graphical processing hardware. This generation's Ada Lovelace architecture delivers an unprecedented and unparalleled level of processing throughput, enabling high settings and higher frame rates in the games you love. The hardware is custom built for immersion, with cores specifically dedicated to ray tracing, the technology that results in the most realistic modeling and recreation of light we've ever seen in gaming. The 40 series GPUs are more than just their hardware. It's also about the suite of technology tools that are enabled by that hardware, like DLSS for example. Nvidia DLSS 3 uses AI to interlace additional frames, resulting in more than double the frame rate in select titles, while Nvidia Reflex works with your monitor to significantly reduce input delay, a huge buff in competitive games where split-second reaction timing is key. Nvidia is always working with game makers to make sure their tech is present in the biggest and best releases. Games like Black Myth Wukong and Star Wars Outlaws both make use of ray tracing and Nvidia DLSS, so if you're playing the latest releases and want them to look and run their absolute best, an Nvidia GeForce RTX 40 series GPU is the obvious choice. The Gigabyte Aorus GeForce RTX 4080 Super elevates Nvidia's tech even further. It has 3 110mm fans for maximum cooling, smart RGB fusion so you can customize how it looks, a super sturdy construction, and 4 years total warranty, one of the best levels of support across the entire industry. So if you're looking for the absolute best GPU hardware made by the most trusted and reliable GPU manufacturer, then I really recommend checking out Gigabyte Aorus's full lineup of Nvidia GeForce RTX 40 series GPUs. I'll leave a link to their product pages below the like button. A big thanks to Nvidia and Gigabyte Aorus for sponsoring the video, and a big thanks to you for watching it.